You're welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to look at another essential of a valid contract, which is the intention to create legal relations. For a contract to be legally enforceable, the parties involved must want to create legal obligations. Without this intention, then no valid contract exists. So we have the business or commercial agreements. So these agreements are presumed to have legal intent unless they are explicitly stated otherwise. So in business or commercial settings, agreements are generally presumed to have legal intention unless it is stated by the parties. So this means that if two businesses or individuals enter into a commercial arrangement, the law assumes that both parties intend for an agreement to be legally binding. Then for the social/domestic agreements, so these are agreements among family and friends, and they are presumed not to be legally binding unless there is proof of a commercial element. So the difference between business and then social is that for business, they are presumed to have legal intent unless it is stated otherwise. Then for the social, they are presumed not to have legal intent unless it is stated otherwise. So for the social, these are agreements made between family members, friends, or close associates, and they are generally presumed not to have legal intention unless there is clear evidence of a commercial element. So this presumption exists because personal relationships often involve informal promises that are not meant to be legally enforceable. However, if there is evidence of a commercial element, then it can be legally binding. Case examples that we have, the first case is the case of Jones versus Padavaton. So in this case, a mother promised to provide financial support to her daughter if she left her job in the US and moved to England to study law. So the mother later bought a house for the daughter to live in, but later the mother sought to take possession of the property. So a dispute arose when the mother tried to evict her daughter, and the daughter claimed a legal right to stay based on their agreement. So the issue was, did the mother and the daughter intend to create a legally binding contract? So court ruled that the agreement was a domestic agreement with no legal intention. So the promise was made in a family context and lacked formal contractual elements such as clear terms and enforceability. So as a result, the mother was entitled to recover possession of the house because the contract between the mother and the daughter was not binding. So parental promises or financial support for education are typically not legally binding. Social or domestic agreements require clear evidence of legal intent for them to be enforceable. Then the second case we have is the case of Parker versus Clark in 1960. So in this case, an elderly couple, the Clarks, invited a young couple, the Parkers, to move in with them, promising that they would inherit part of their property if they did so. So the Parkers sold their house based on this agreement and moved in with the Clarks. So later, the Clarks changed their minds and asked the Parkers to leave, leading to a legal dispute. So the issue was, did the agreement between the Clarks and the Parkers have legal intent? So the court's decision was in the favor of the Parkers, stating that a legally binding contract existed. The Parkers had suffered financial consequences by selling their house on reliance on the agreement. So this demonstrated an intention to create legal relations, making it an agreement enforceable. So social or domestic agreements can be legally binding if one party relies on the promise to make some decisions, some key decisions. So financial reliance can turn a domestic promise into an enforceable contract because the Parkers relied on that agreement and they sold their house and they moved in with the Clarks. So if they were chasing them away, they had nowhere else to go. So that made it legally binding because they had relied on them financially. Another case we have is the case of Buffer versus Buffer in 1919. So in this case, Mr. Buffer was a government official who lived in Sri Lanka with his wife. So due to her healthy issues, Mrs. Barker, the wife, stayed in England while he returned to work. So Mr. Buffer promised to send her £30 per month for maintenance. Later, he stopped payments and Mrs. Buffer sued him for breach of contract. So the issue was the husband's promise to send money legally binding? So court ruled that it was a domestic agreement without legal intention. So the agreement was made between spouses during their marriage and lacked the characteristics of a contract. So agreements between spouses made in the course of their marriage are presumed not to be legally binding. So courts cannot enforce everyday family arrangements unless there is evidence of a contractual intent. So agreements made between spouses when they're still married are not legally binding. So that was the case of Buffer versus Buffer. Once you see a case like that, like the names are the same, Buffer versus Buffer, it means they are married. It's husband and wife, or it is usually family members. Yeah. Then we have another case of Merit versus Merit. So Merit versus Merit in 1970. So in this case, Mr. and Mrs. Merit were a married couple that were separated when the agreement was made. So they met to discuss financial matters, and Mr. Merit signed a written agreement stating that if Mrs. Merit paid off the mortgage, he would transfer the house to her. So after she completed the payments, he refused to transfer the house and she sued him. So the issue was the agreement between the separated spouses legally binding? So they signed the agreement when they were already separated. Yeah, so the agreement was if Mrs. Merit paid off the mortgage, Mr. Merit would transfer the house to her. So after she completed paying for the mortgage, Mr. Merit refused to transfer the house and she sued him. Yeah, so court ruled that the agreement was legally binding because the couple was separated, meaning their agreement was more like business and not a domestic agreement. So this agreement was in writing, which indicated serious intention. So Mrs. Merit had relied on the agreement by completing the mortgage payments. So this means that agreements between separated spouses are more likely to be legally binding compared to agreements between married couples. Yeah, so written agreements indicate a clear intention to create legal relations. So this case contradicts with the case of Buffer versus Buffer, where the couple was still married. But for Merit versus Merit, the couple was separated.